So Inside Out 2 is the sequel to the first Inside Out movie, which came out in 2015, and it stars Amy Poehler, Phyllis Smith, Lewis Black, Tony Hale, Liza Lapira, Maya Hawke, Ayoa Debris, and Paul Walter Hauser. And in this movie, taking place about a year or so after the first Inside Out movie, Riley is going through a few new changes in her life. Meanwhile, a bunch of new emotions begin appearing in her head, and those emotions begin taking control, pushing out sadness, joy, fear and such, all them out, and basically they have to try to make their way back to the console before Riley loses her sense of self. So this is a movie that, even though I absolutely love the first Inside Out movie, I was not looking forward to it. Now, again, I really enjoyed the first Inside Out movie. That was a movie that I remember not really looking forward to, but then eventually around the time when I did see it, which I think it was like a couple weeks after it came out, I immediately fell in love with it. I fell in love with the world building, the characters are great, the animation was incredible, the emotional impact was, it really hit me at the time, and it was like, this is a movie that was like, that was at the time, which I won't go into, it's like, this is the movie I kind of need right now. It was a movie that is still held up over these years, and I still think it's a really well done Pixar movie. Maybe my favorite Pixar movie, personally. So, when a sequel was announced, admittedly, I was not looking forward to it, because I don't think a lot of the Pixar sequels are particularly great. Now, don't get me wrong, Toy Story 2 and 3 are really good. Toy Story 4, not so much. Finding Dory, not so much. Monsters University, not so much. Incredibles 2, not as good as Incredibles 1. And I was worried that Inside Out 2 was going to just fall into that pattern of like, let's make a sequel to one of our best movies, and maybe it just won't be as good as the first movie. Well, in a sense, it is kind of right in my... Well, that is kind of right in my opinion, because like, I do feel like this movie is not as good as Inside Out 1. Is it still good? It is pretty good for the most part. But there are some things where I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I don't like this part, but I'll dive into that later. Let's start off what I do like. First off, the voice actors are still really good. Amy Poehler still really good as Joy. Her character is really well done in this movie. Also, among the new additions, Maya Hawke is really good as Anxiety. I thought her character was really well done. Ayoa Debris does a really good job in this movie too, but I kind of want to talk about something about her character later on. I feel like her character wasn't very envious. Whereas, like, you know, I can see Amy Poehler playing Joy and Maya Hawke playing Anxiety and Lewis Black as Anger and such, but, like, I never felt her character was envious, really. Meanwhile, as with any other Pixar movie, the animation is just jaw-dropping. It is gorgeous. It is just absolutely beautiful to look at. And they do a lot of different types of animation styles at different times. It's like, okay, that's actually kind of fun. That's actually kind of interesting to kind of see, like, you blending all these animation styles together. It's like, that's kind of cool, which that kind of happened in the first movie. But again, I'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, I still think there's a lot of creativity inside Riley's mind. And I'm pretty sure it's like, you know, inside everyone's mind and such. But there are so many things that kind of didn't go into in the first movie. It's like, oh, okay, that's also kind of really fascinating. One of the things I really liked about the first Inside Out movie was how creative they were about various things and such. Sure, there were like, you know, inside jokes and such and like, you know, puns and such, but it was still pretty creative of like how they kind of like showed the mind and such. And here, I feel like that's no different here. Like, they show a lot of creativity here. There's a lot of great, interesting things they're doing with it. And I'm like, that's pretty fascinating what you're doing with that. Meanwhile, I do think there is an important lesson about anxiety in this movie, about how it's, you know, I don't want to say it's necessary, but I say it's like, it's there, it's gonna happen, and I feel like the way they kind of show, like, anxiety throughout the entire movie is pretty well done, and I'm kind of glad that nowadays, like, we get movies like this, kids movies that kind of, like, talk about, like, anxiety and such, especially movies like this that are, you know, larger and such. I feel like I didn't really get movies like that as a kid, or maybe I just didn't watch those movies when I was younger because, like, I didn't really have words at the time. But now that I've seen movies like Inside Out, it's like, oh, okay, understanding emotions a little bit more, and I feel like I understand a little bit more. It's like, okay, that's pretty fascinating. I do like that. Meanwhile, the world building is still incredible, particularly when they go into like all the mind stuff, and it's very fascinating. It's really awesome to see. And I do think this movie can be pretty funny. This movie got me laughing a few times where it's like, I'm kind of glad that like they didn't show the best jokes in the trailer. And I do think that a lot of the jokes kind of caught me off guard. It's like, okay, that was pretty funny. Usually Disney trailers do a really good job of like hiding the really good stuff until the actual movie. Usually, don't mention Wish, but like they usually are pretty funny when you watch the movie. So I'm kind of glad that I'm kind of glad I didn't see any trailers where it's like, okay, they showed a lot of humor and such. But let's talk about the things I don't like about this movie. First off, it does the thing that Disney does a lot that I really can't stand. It's not the one you're thinking, but they constantly are being derivative of the original movie. And honestly, there were so many times where I was watching, it's like, oh, that's like this moment from the first movie. Oh, that's like this moment from the first movie. And it kind of just happens. And even back like a few minutes ago, even, I was like, wait, that also kind of happened in the first movie too. So this movie definitely has a lot of moments where it's like, you're just relying on your, what you remember from the first movie. And Disney has been doing that a lot. They did it with Star Wars, they did it with Mary Poppins. Their Disney live action remakes are incredibly guilty of this. And it's just kind of annoying how many times I was watching this movie, I'm like, oh, that was just like the original movie. That's kind of disappointing in my opinion. Meanwhile, I felt like some of the new voice actors, it kind of took a while to get into. Now, Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling did not return for this movie, or allegedly due to salary disputes. And honestly, their voices don't really match the new ones. Tony Hale, great. I loved him on Arrested Development and everything. But it took a while for me to get used to him as a peer, especially considering I love Bill Hader too. But he was good for a while, so he was good after a while, so I'm okay with that. Meanwhile, I felt like there were a few missed opportunities here and there. As I mentioned, Envy, at times it never really felt like Envy was very envious. There were like a couple lines where I was like, ooh, I wish I was taller, or I wish I had hair like that, or something like that. But I never really felt that. Like, I felt Maya Hawke was anxiety, and Amy Poehler was joy, and Phyllis Smith was sadness, and so on and so forth. Never really felt that with her. Good performance, but maybe I blame the writers of that performance more than Ayo Edebiri. There's also a few missed opportunities where it's like, there's one of the islands that's very small now that used to be in the first movie. It's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what they're going to do with that small island now. Nothing. Meanwhile, it's like, okay, they kind of run into a few new characters in this movie, so it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what's going to happen with this movie, and like, in terms of their characters and such. They don't really do much with that either, unfortunately. So it's kind of disappointing. It's like, oh, it's cool for the moment, but let's be honest, it doesn't really matter much in this movie. And it's a movie that I feel like I enjoyed for the most part, but I kind of have a lot of issues with it. The voice acting is incredible. The animation is jaw-dropping. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's, Pixar animation is always going to be top tier. There is a lot of creativity with the mind. There's a lot of creativity with the themes and such. There's a lot of great world building. It can be pretty funny. There's that moment in the movie when you kind of realize what this movie's really about. And it's like, it just kind of like sits with you for a moment. It's like, oh, that's what this movie's about. And I do think it is very effective in that way. But this movie can be very derivative of the first movie. It has a lot of new voice actors that don't really do much. It has a few missed opportunities here and there. And honestly, I felt like this movie's not as good as Inside Out 1. Better than some other animated movies this year, which isn't really saying much. But I still think, because the themes of itself are pretty fascinating, the performances are really good, and the world building is still really incredible, I would still recommend this movie enough to at least see it at some point. So I'll give Inside Out 2 3 out of 4 stars. See it. So, what's your favorite Pixar sequel, if you like any of them, besides Toy Story 2 and 3? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.